Awesome. So today we're going to do the first session of the CAVE program, which is the Community Advocacy and Voter Engagement Certification Program with NPH. So I'm super excited. Again, thanks everyone for being here. If y'all could please do chat box intros, that would be super helpful. Your name, your pronoun, your organization, and what you're hoping to get out of this session. I really want this session to be a collaborative space where all of y'all can get to know each other, even with the limitations of being online. And so sharing a little bit about yourselves can really help us understand who's here with us today and how this may be impacting you. So for the agenda, we're hoping it's going to be an hour and a half or maybe an hour 15 session. I always love giving people time back, so I'll try my best to shorten it whenever possible, but hopefully y'all are available for an hour and 15. Today we'll go over introductions, acknowledgements, and the program overview. We'll talk about the importance of historical narratives for advocates. We'll go over the creation of HUD and state affordable housing programs. We'll talk about successful housing campaigns and how we can leverage that when talking to our residents every day about why civic engagement is important. And we'll talk about how the history of our housing movement and of racial equity impacts our current reality today. So this is a little bit about me. All of y'all are most of y'all seem pretty familiar to me. I've seen you in either the Resident Voter Engagement 101 sessions or just in other email chains. So thanks so much for being a part of today. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm really excited to be hosting these events and talking about advocacy and affordable housing. And today I'm also joined by someone super special, Ronald, who's our guest speaker. Ronald, do you want to talk a little bit about yourself during this section?
Yeah, and actually I'd love to just highlight the first part of my bio that just an organizer who believes housing is a human right, that there is an abundant world that meets our human needs, that we can get there with effective advocacy and organizing. I will share that I also use they, them pronouns, and I've worked all across the East Bay the last 3 years for a kind of a unified movement for housing justice that includes affordable housing creation for the lowest income levels, and anti-displacement land use policies and tenant rights work. And yeah, really thrilled to be able to participate in this CAVE series because I love this focus on resident services. And we'll share that I think it's true for actually Azul and I both, that we've both worked in resident services before, and I think we're really excited about just leveraging all the relationship and power that you all create in affordable housing properties. And then I have another disclaimer. Is it okay to share?
Of course.
Just that my cat escaped my home about 90 minutes ago. And so I've been in a little bit of distressed panic mode. And I'm sure there's cat lovers on this call who sympathize with me and animal lovers of all sorts. And just to say that I'm gonna likely bow out a little bit earlier to go search for this animal of mine, and that I do think the best thing, and I'm sure y'all would agree, is to not be panicked. So I just wanted to name that because that's part of my energy on this call this morning. But we've been prepping for this for weeks, and I definitely didn't want to miss it. So happy to be here.
And thanks so much for sharing that and just being, real about where you are emotionally. I know a lot of us are going through things right now, and I think self-care and just being open and honest about where we're at just really helps our movement stay sustainable. So thanks for being with us, even though your cat is lost. But yeah. Cool. So a little more on this idea of like acknowledgements and just being honest and direct. For today's training, we also want to acknowledge, I'm sure Ronald agrees, that we are on stolen indigenous Ohlone land, and due to our citizenship status, not all of us or our residents have the ability to vote. However, we do think that everyone can make an impact on their communities through advocacy and participation, regardless of our age, level of education, or economic status. And fundamentally, we believe housing is a human right. So those are going to be the threads of all of our conversations today. And we just wanted to name that directly. So maybe some of y'all are wondering, like, what is this session? So I do just want to say welcome to the NPH CAVE certification series. Ronald encouraged me to say welcome to the cave, welcome to like this space where we're creating conversation as resident services staff and as people who support residents to talk more in depth about our role in advocacy and voter engagement. This is going to be a 3-part series. We'll have opportunities for makeup. That's why I'm recording all of the sessions. So if after this session you feel like, hey, somebody on my team would really benefit from being a part of it, I can send them the recording and then they can join as well. Or if you're not able to make all 3 sessions at the scheduled time, I can send you the video recording as well. Ronald will be our first guest speaker, followed by Jay Carmona, who is an LGBT civil rights digital organizer, and Lucia Obregon will join us for the last session, talking a little bit about leadership development after the election. And then I wanted to just showcase what y'all will get after participating in these 3-part series. You'll get a really cool certificate that just shows that you are certified by NPH as an advocate. And really the add value of that is just growing professionally and figuring out what is the best career pathway within affordable housing for you. And I'm really happy to be able to provide that as a framework. So thinking a little bit about more, what are these sessions? What is the purpose? So CAVE stands for Community Advocacy and Voter Engagement. It's intended to serve as a long-term pathway for advocates and movement building for resident services staff who are interested in getting more involved with civic participation on a local and regional level. So for me, this is super important, and I'm sure for Ronald as well. As we mentioned, we were both in resident services staff in the past, and I really do see that building a sustainable movement starts with community and the core people who are doing this work. And I think it's really important for resident services staff to have a voice in the decision-making process on the local and regional level. And then also I just want to provide a collaborative space and develop a type of cohort where we can work together in group and coalition to talk about social justice and change in affordable housing and advocacy and how that relates to voter engagement. So similarly to other like fellowship programs or development programs, it's just really cool to have a network of people who you can reference and talk to and be like, hey, like we were a part of this. And through that, we decided to come up with something greater than what we had going on. So why is this important? Just talking about why this was created a little bit, we took your feedback to heart. So a lot of what people told us is that voter engagement and advocacy can't just happen before the elections. It needs to be a year-round conversation. And that really resonates with me and Ronald as well, to think about what that looks like and to start to create it, dream about it, and put it into action prior to being in a situation where we're 2 months ahead, we're 2 months away from the election. What's going to happen? We want to build on this long term. It's also an opportunity for professional development as resident services staff to learn more about the history of affordable housing, digital organizing tools, and communication strategies to develop leadership. And investing in resident services staff is essential to building a housing justice movement. So those are really the things that, for me, make this program so special and what I'm so excited about bringing to y'all. So some of y'all may be wondering, like, why are we choosing to center historical housing narratives as the first part of this session? So really it comes from a place of understanding that this is a spectrum of events. It's not just what's happening today or what's going to happen tomorrow. It's about what's been happening. And how that relates to racial justice and equity, and how that relates to our work every single day. So we want to create a baseline of understanding on how affordable housing got started. What are the racial inequities that have persisted over time? What does exclusion look like? What does advocacy look like when we leverage history? We want to take historic examples of organizing, social structural issues, and apply them to everyday situations to find the solutions and strategies that are going to help us when we're talking about engagement. And we want to explain key events or historical realities to residents or folks on your team who can support you engage in residency engagement efforts by giving tangible examples of wins. So this is something super important to me because oftentimes so many of our community members are, disillusioned, disenfranchised, feel like their voice isn't important. And we really want to highlight times throughout history where that has not been the case and where people standing up have made a really substantial difference. So I'm just going to give a few examples. with Ronald's help about historic racial struggles for housing in the Bay Area. This is spanning a larger time frame of about starting around the 1950s, 1960s to present. We've really had these deep struggles about cultural preservation, racial inequities, and what that's looked like for housing in the Bay Area. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the Fillmore District redevelopment in San Francisco. So is everyone familiar with the Fillmore District in San Francisco, or has anyone not ever been there? And it's okay if you haven't. No? Cool. So the really cool thing about the Fillmore is district, it was historically known as the Harlem of the West. So it was where a large part of the Black community was centered. This is where the Black Renaissance of the West happened, where James Baldwin was there. A lot of cool people who were like part of this social justice and like talking about African-American rights participated in. There was the core of the jazz scene in San Francisco. And around the 1960s and 1970s, we saw what they called the Black Exodus, which is African-American and Black people started leaving this area because the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency put together a plan to rezone, and this idea of modernizing this area and building up and just changing the face of this community. So that led to massive displacement of the Black community. And this is something really important to highlight because it's history that's not always recognized. And previously to this redevelopment, this area was 30% African American. And as we know here in San Francisco right now, the Black community is really low, like it's like 4 or 7% or something right now. So this is a really pivotal moment in history. And I just wanted to highlight it to talk about cultural placekeeping and why it's so important for us to think about racial equity when we're thinking about housing. One of the great positives that came out of this, and it is not at all like enough, it's not reparations enough, but it is something. The city of San Francisco has in place what they call the COP certificate, which is the certificate of preference. And this is given to folks who were displaced from the Fillmore district due to redevelopment. And the benefit of that is when you apply to the housing lottery in San Francisco for affordable housing, it gives you a higher chance of getting housing. So this is just one way that we can think about how we can advocate for communities of color in the present. The next example that I wanted to highlight is the iHotel in San Francisco. So this is a building that was in downtown San Francisco on Kearny Street. And pretty much the whole idea, or like the whole reason this is important, it was because it was like the last stand for Manila Town. So if you all know, in Chinatown in San Francisco, there used to be an area called Manila Town where it was predominantly Filipino immigrants and workers. And the iHotel was really this core place where so many residents lived, seniors, low-income people, working class people, and San Francisco was redeveloping. So this huge historic battle took place starting November 27th, 1968. For 9 years, people fought for an anti-eviction campaign to retain residency. And they were met with huge resistance. 400 riot police came to disband 3,000 people who had locked arms to try to retain this community. And even though they eventually were evicted in 1977 and the building was destroyed in 1979, the big wins out of this are that the CCDC, which is Chinatown Community Development Center in San Francisco, was created through this process. The Chinese Progressive Association came out of this work, and it really became a pivotal moment for the Asian American community and thinking about historic preservation. So again, this is just thinking about racial equity in housing and why it's so important. Another big key point is the Monster and the Mission in San Francisco. This is more recent, in 2013 to 2020. This big building was proposed to be built on 16th and Mission, which is part of a historical cultural corridor for the Latinx community in San Francisco. And all of these different organizations, grassroots organizations, put together a coalition called Plaza 16. And what they did is pretty much organize against this building being built that was not 100% affordable housing, because in this area, they have already seen huge loss of the Latinx community. A lot of people have left, and it's really becoming this class struggle and this race struggle on who gets to be a part of San Francisco even today. So this is something I wanted to highlight. One of the great things that came out of this as well, after so many years of fighting, they finally won the battle against this building, the Monster in the Mission, and they are now going to build 100% affordable housing, where before it was a mixed income building. That would have really changed the landscape of that neighborhood. So when we're thinking about cultural preservation and affordable housing, we do play a huge role when we provide space for communities of color to thrive. One of the other cases in Oakland, California, this is also super recent, the Moms for Housing. I'm not sure if y'all are familiar or if you saw news stories about this, but pretty much these two Black mothers in Oakland said, hey, like, housing is a human right. Me and my kids shouldn't be living in a car. There are these houses that are empty. Let's try to occupy them. Let's talk about housing justice. Let's take a stand, and let's really start to put community at the center of this work and what it means to have affordable housing that is accessible to everyone. So even though these folks did not win their case to take ownership of the home, they still made a historic statement and about, again, cultural preservation, Black communities having a place in Oakland that has always been a historically Black city, and what it looks like when people come together for a cause. Yeah, and then Ronald, do you want to talk a little bit about Contra Costa?
Yeah, definitely. And I think we just wanted to give more examples of, you know, housing fights that have that historic bend. And as a more recent example of that, I think we're really excited by the link between housing and immigrant justice we're seeing in Contra Costa County. And this is an image from the city of Concord in a coalition called the Raise the Roof Coalition that had organized a really successful May Day March last year and the year prior. And you can see there so many Latinx residents of the Monument Corridor within the city of Concord who, you know, are fighting for basic tenant rights, the ability to stay, anti-displacement measures, and also resonating really powerfully with that same signifier that housing is a human right. And I think you can see there that it's not just an issue in the cities, but it also touches in the suburbs. And as sprawl grows and as displacement grows and as more residents of in the Bay Area, in Alameda and San Francisco County get displaced out beyond into Contra Costa County, also the fight for housing justice grows. Not to say that there hasn't been decades-long fights for housing justice in the suburbs, but that what we're seeing in more recent years is a power building and an acknowledgement of shared regional you know, need for housing and for housing justice.
Yeah, that's an awesome point, Ronald. Just really tying that together, thinking about how it's a ripple effect, right? If one area doesn't have affordable housing, then it starts to go further. People have to move further and further out, and then that leads to new opportunities to build power and to have conversations about social justice. You know, it's not the preferred way. Hopefully, we would always just talk about that without people being in those situations. But it's great to acknowledge that this is something that's happening regionally.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and take over the presentation and start to share these same slides. And is that okay to grab the baton from here, Azul? We wanted to give more of this historical overview of you know, the affordable housing, the world of affordable housing. So you could think of it as an industry or a sector or as advocacy space. It's been a big part of our government infrastructure for decades and decades. I think we observe pretty plainly that we have an affordable housing crisis in our present day. And so I think giving this historical overview to help explain a little more why do we have this so much housing inequity in the present. And starting with a little overview that goes all the way back to the 1930s. And I think we want to just lift up that there was, at that time, right, the Great Depression was a key feature of President Roosevelt's New Deal to create a federal housing administration, um, which worked with a lending corporation that was also started by the government to guarantee home mortgages. Um, and I think it's actually known and thought of in our history as a really successful program. And I think what was obscured a lot in the telling of this history has been the extremely racist outcomes of these programs. So many Americans, white Americans, were lifted up into home ownership, but that this was also when the practice of redlining began. And I've got some images here that show the kinds of pamphlets and education that the Federal Housing Administration was doing then. You can see both the white families, but you can also see that they're trying to create for Americans this goal of a modern, right, single family home. And that also became then a really clear piece of the American dream and the California dream for working families to be able to own their own home. And that the government was assisting in that, but that it was especially assisting, or only assisting rather, white families. We've dropped here the term redlining, and we wanted to show here a map. Sorry, this is an example of redlining in the city of Berkeley. And I think what's important to show here, this is a map from the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which was that loan corporation that was started in the 1930s, where they're grading lending and the risk of lending based on neighborhoods by assigning a color, and that the red areas were considered hazardous lending, and that the I guess the criteria for hazardous lending was whether or not there were Black families living in those neighborhoods. And so really clearly racially divided neighborhoods where opportunity was also, for homeownership, was also divided. And then if you're at all familiar with present day Berkeley, or if you were to align the redlining maps for your own city with current housing needs in your current city, there's a real correlation between historic divestment in those neighborhoods and then the current housing needs. So in this example of Berkeley, you can see South Berkeley was the area that was redlined. South Berkeley is also the place where we've seen the majority of displacement and gentrification of Black and brown families out of Berkeley in recent years. So there's other interesting correlations here too with red lines, but we just wanted to show what are we talking about with that term. Moving forward, so we had in the 30s, the Federal Housing Administration. Actually in the 60s, and this is part to do with civil rights organizing and the Fair Housing Law, Congress recreated the Federal Housing Administration as a new department called Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. Which is, I think we're all familiar with HUD, but this is the origin of it. It was founded to be able to provide subsidies that would make affordable housing more feasible to create. And the idea was government needs to create these subsidies because otherwise there is no good market solution for affordable rents. And they also provided these low interest rates to private actors. So it was the beginning of nonprofits and other housing developers being able to create affordable housing, and it resulted in a boom. One of the effects of this too is that it was assigned to the president's cabinet. And so there was a level of accountability that's created there, but also politicization where different presidents would appoint different secretaries, right? And with totally different housing agendas. And so there's always been a little, HUD has always been a structure that's subject to the whims of the president. And a good example of that is actually in the 70s, when President Nixon declared a moratorium on the construction of new housing through HUD, which is to say that HUD used to work really closely with public housing authorities to create municipal or social housing that was owned or managed by these local democratic public institutions. That practice ended through this moratorium, and that Nixon followed that up with this Housing and Community Development Act in the 70s that basically made that job the job of local jurisdictions, and also created then Section 8 housing vouchers, which was a tool that local jurisdictions were supposed to be using to create deep affordability. Obviously, there were many problems with that program. And similarly, they created in the 70s these community development grants that they would just give to cities that would help subsidize their affordable housing creation. So it became less the job of HUD as the federal government, more the job of local jurisdictions. That was something that in California looked really interesting, because that same decade we were experiencing a real upsurge of that idea of homeowner populism, or the idea that that the California dream was really to own your own home, not to live in an affordable rental unit. And I think because that was the ideology of California, still very much is, we had the passage of Prop 13, or this tax revolt that really hurts our ability to fairly assess property taxes, and those revenues that were generated through those tax assessments were essentially lost because of the California tax revolt. The loss of revenue hurt, public goods of all sorts, including schools and hospitals. But I think there's a really clear, we lost a lot that could have gone towards affordable housing. And this is actually on the ballot this year, so keep an eye on that. Going back to the federal government level, we had in the 80s just a continuation of this federal divestment through the creation of low-income housing tax credits that really tried to bring banks into the equation, because the answer they're always trying to, or the question they're always trying to answer rather, is how do we find the funds that are out there in our economy to create affordable housing, which is, and I think this was the idea of, this is the market solution, to incentivize banks through tax credits to provide really reasonable loans to affordable housing creators. Again, it's using banks to answer this question as opposed to having federal funds, and I think really helps explain the kind of the housing development ecosystem we have these days. I'll just say too, in the 80s was when a lot of advocacy organizations for affordable housing were also created. And so that was also kind of the start of this work we do now. And then thinking about I know this is skipping now something like 30 years, but I did want to bring it back to focusing in California specifically. We had these redevelopment agencies that were public entities that were raising all the time money to create more affordable housing. They were also the agencies that determined public land use. And so if there were just property that's owned by the city, that the redevelopment agencies could try to use those lands for the creation of affordable housing, or for some other really important public use. And that in 2012, actually, the California Supreme Court abolished redevelopment agencies one of the impacts of that was losing over $1 billion annually. And so I think what we want to try to show with this history is the first the creation of these institutions like HUD, but then that at the federal level, for many decades, they've been trying to make affordable housing the work of local governments, and that because of that, and because of California politics, especially, it means we have a job ahead of us as advocates to work at the local level, county level, and the state level, and the regional level rather, to try to take on this big task of housing our people, and that's part of the reason why it's such a difficult job. So I wanted to pause here and just offer any thoughts, questions, reflections about this history we've shared or any of the content that Zool covered already. And you could unmute yourself, or you could also feel really free to put your questions in the chat. Oops.
Especially if you'll have any clarifying questions, any terms that didn't make sense. So we really want to make sure that this is like an accessible learning space. So please don't be shy to ask any questions, either in chat or unmute.
Hi, this is Yaya with Alta Housing. Yasari Villalobos on the screen. I just want to say thank you for giving all that background information. I've never had that in a training webinar experience, and it's just so helpful to move forward with, and especially that you guys had it in such like understandable terms. So thank you for that. And I do have questions, but I'll wait till the end. I feel like they'll be answered.
I do have one clarifying question about 1965. FHA was recreated into HUD, and it was providing low interest rates to private owners. And I kind of didn't really understand who those private owners were. I was kind of hearing nonprofits, affordable housing developers, but I mean, just some clarity on who those private owners were, and seeing that this investment that came afterwards, why they were giving low interest rates to developers of affordable housing, if that's who they were giving money to.
Yeah, I think when I think of private owners, I do think it's to say these weren't public institutions. And so I think a lot of the work of creating affordable housing was on the shoulders of housing authorities, who would, and I think housing authorities continue to not to develop, but to maintain, right, and provide affordable housing, social housing, municipal housing, and that it was from the 60s beyond, and especially in the 70s, that there began to be less of an emphasis on those public institutions creating municipal housing, and rather having private actors, which I would categorize as both for-profit and nonprofit developers, creating affordable housing. And I think that you could think of it as that's what privatization looks like in America. And it's also that same time period where a lot of, I think there's other examples of government institutions that were beginning to be privatized at that time. And your question was about who are these private actors, and I would say it's just to say they're not public folks, so it could be for-profits and nonprofits both.
That makes sense. Thank you. That helps.
And then, yeah, I think if you have other reflections or thoughts and you want to save them, there is some time once we get past this next section for some small group conversation and other sharing. So,
I had a quick question. Do you mind?
Yeah, of course.
With the impact of the loss of the redevelopment money, was that ever replaced by the government with another form of money for affordable housing?
That is a very good question, but I would say no. And it's you can imagine then the tough task they create for affordable housing developers when you take away $1 billion off the table and then it's not replaced with the similar funds. And then we are going to talk more about that and the need for local funding measures. And you'll have seen, actually on this slide is a great example of propositions 1 and 2 that were on the ballot in California. Was that last year? No, in 2018.
The year before.
Right, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
But yeah, I think that's actually, it's a good point too that we're segueing into some good information here. And I'm gonna try to move forward. I'm sorry, I just want to
Ronald, do you need me to switch to sharing? Or do you want to try to?
If this slide loads, my slide won't load, Azul. Do you feel okay?
Yeah, no worries. I can totally do that. And I'll just click for you. That's okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. We will power through all these random mishaps. Okay. Can you all see my screen?
Yeah.
Cool. Thanks everyone for your patience as we're like still working on our own digital literacy. I know I am.
So this next slide should be talking about this concept of her story. We wanted to, or I really like to bring up just that when we offer the history as we've just done, I think history can feel a little hard to resonate with or to see ourselves in. And especially because of, I think, the powerful folks we have in this training today, just wanting to affirm that even if we don't if we're not familiar with these histories, we do understand the problem we're facing, right? And everybody, through our own personal experiences and the experiences of our loved ones, we know we have a housing crisis. We know that for decades, right, it has been really painfully difficult for us to create enough affordable housing. There's never been enough to meet the needs of our communities. And so just wanting to offer this concept of her story, which is less about laws and like especially the men who make decisions in power, more about our experiences as people in community, or as women, right? And thinking then of this power that we get from sharing our own stories and experiences. I think it can be useful because that, I think, is where our power lies. And I wanted to offer these two poems. And sorry, just want to shout out Urban Habitat is the group that put together this comic book around the her story of the Bay Area. Could you move to the next slide, Azul? And these are also, as I said, two poems that are talking about what it feels like when we get disconnected from real histories. And I wonder, Azul, would you read the left one and I could read the right one?
Yeah, definitely. So the left one's going to be the one in the yellow box. So lost or forgotten, I can't grasp or comprehend my father's language because he never taught me. It's mine like DNA and fingerprints, but words clumsily trip off my tongue as I mimic the phone conversation in the next room. We are not written down and will be erased from history. And the effects of imperialism are like asbestos in old ceilings. Oh, asbestos in old ceilings. It's never leaving, and it's just so much more than language.
And then on the right side, another woman thinking, lost or forgotten, white like missing heritage, like blank space, like writing history with cultureless feet, being the daughter of the daughter of the daughter of immigrants gives her nothing more than dark hair and washed out family legends. She wants to walk this frayed tightrope of history backwards to her great grandmother, plead, teach me, teach me. I think actually it could have, maybe would have been nice to have another reflection slide right here, but I think really just trying to offer as we transition to where is our power in this as advocates and as people embedded in affordable housing communities? And just wanting to make sure that as we offer you, more awareness of the history of racial segregation and housing in the Bay Area, that we're also offering you this other reframe of not thinking of it as a history that we don't know, remembering our own experiences actually teach us a lot about the fight ahead of us. And Azul, is inviting folks, if you do want to speak at all to this, feel free to leave a comment or just interject and jump in. You're very welcome to unmute yourself during this presentation. And I think we want to, really make sure to highlight also in the history that we've tried to overview with you, the culture of segregation and redlining that we really feel, or it's a history that still needs to be transformed in our present. So we talked about redevelopment agencies, and I think it would be, it is important to add in that one element of redevelopment was always about clearing, quote, blighted areas, or this other term of urban renewal, which has been about redeveloping areas that are majority Black or brown or immigrant or low income areas, and that there's so much pain associated with the term redevelopment or the terms like urban renewal. And so there is a complex history there of how these agencies, recreated cities entirely, but without community control or without community input or community benefit, so that, and that the neighborhoods where this strategy was really employed were majority Black neighborhoods where Black families were facing, homes being bulldozed and forced displacement. So that's another part of all this history we're giving you. And we've talked a little bit already about the Homeowners Loan Corporation. I think it is an important thing when we think of that kind of idyllic single family home. So many white families who enjoy those kinds of homes, that we highlight that history of inequitable or racist lending that was guaranteed by the government, by HUD prior to HUD being HUD. And then this image actually shows you, I think it's maybe kind of the perfect image for this idea of homeowner populism or suburbanization. This has been always a key feature of our cities, and certainly very true of the Bay Area. When we think of how city planners were, what their goals were decades ago, before we had so many people in such a pronounced housing crisis, the hope was always to have kind of inner city revitalization, thriving downtown neighborhoods, lots of industry and factory work for workers, but then also that workers could own their own home and commute really reasonably in and out. I think the focus on home ownership and sort of having each family with their own mini kingdom, right, in this beautiful industrial garden, that development ideology is a big piece of why we don't have enough affordable homes now. And I think this next slide, could you move forward, Azul? Just wanting to think about how important it is for us to do this work also in the suburbs and to be trying to affirmatively further fair housing and creating affordable housing in neighborhoods where previously there was none. And that a lot of these jurisdictions that, maybe they're 5, 10, 20, 30 minutes away from, our big cities like Oakland or San Jose, that those jurisdictions in the past were not creating affordable housing, not welcoming in the need or the residents, and that there was a lot of racial stereotyping, a lot of predatory zoning, and that whole NIMBY attitude still exists. And so it's one of the reasons why we have to go to the suburbs with our work, and understanding that when we do that, and when we do create true affordable housing out there, that we are addressing really decades-long exclusionary development practices. I think offering this for any of you on this call who aren't based in one of the big cities, but also just like we'd said earlier, trying to think about, how do we regionally, or how do we think regionally about these problems, and beyond our own cities.
And if I could just make a comment too, like just to highlight, talking a little bit about this idea of the ripple effect, right? And how it is so cyclical that in these earlier times, like 60s, 70s, 80s, we saw what's called white flight from urban cities, and then they went to the suburbs and they created these communities that were, well invested, segregated. And now we're seeing the inversion of that, which is now being in the inner city is, again, cool. It's something people want to do. It's the preferred lifestyle in a lot of white narratives. And then what we're seeing is the impact of that is people of color being pushed out to the suburbs, the suburbanization of poverty, as they call it, like this idea that poor people should not live in these urban metropolitan areas because they're not contributing to the economy in the same ways. So it's really all just a ripple effect, and it's a communication narrative, right, of how these issues are framed. And once we understand those things, we can think a lot deeper about advocacy and how to deconstruct those narratives. So I just wanted to put that in there because we're talking a lot about racism and exclusionary development practices. So the more we understand the history, the more we can combat it.
Absolutely right. And it's all about transforming it in the present. I think this is where we really want to offer this concept of transformative organizing. And I think it is likely you may already identify as a transformative organizer. You may already be a transformative organizer. It's what's happening when we invest in the unlikely leaders, right? Or the everyday leaders around us. And I think if you are living in affordable housing, or if you work amongst affordable housing residents, then I imagine that every day you are surrounded by these really open-hearted, compassionate, oftentimes politicized folks. Yeah, I like this suggestion as well. Would somebody like to volunteer to read out this quote from Ajan Poo, who's a organizer with the Domestic Workers Alliance?
Sure, I can read it.
Thanks, Ajan.
It's precisely the people who are considered the least likely leaders who end up inspiring others most. Everyday people and everyday acts of courage eventually change everything.
And that's, I think, is going to be the theme of the rest of this presentation too. We want to hone in on this. I'll just offer too, a good way to understand transformative organizing is that we are, as on a one-to-one level, right, through the people that we enter relationship with around us, we seek to create a transformation within that person, so that they see themselves as a leader, and that will have the impact of transforming systems. And so taking those who would say, oh, I have nothing to offer movement, I'm not an organizer, this isn't my work, and bringing them into movement, so that we can change these systems. And that's what transformative organizing is also really all about. And it starts at the one-to-one level, really recognizing that when we feel vulnerable amongst ourselves, or when we use empathy, and when we're guided by feeling, I think oftentimes out in the world, in the economy, certainly true of how our housing system works, I think our weaknesses just feel like weaknesses. And I think transformative organizing or resident-based organizing work that's relational, it's really about turning those weaknesses into strengths and being able to say, make heartfelt connections with the people around us, in the first place to affirm that their experiences are similar to our own experiences, right? And that we maybe think about the issue the same way, and that they're not alone, but then also to make that connection that helps draw them into deeper involvement with our campaigns and our advocacy work. And so wanting to bring these two slides in, this concept of weakness as strength, because we really feel it's where y'all are most powerful. And I don't want to characterize any of your work as being led by feeling. I don't have personal relationship with y'all, but I do know with a resident services perspective that it's oftentimes so much about people and the experiences of our residents. And I know in my case, I certainly have grown to really love and care about the people in affordable housing. So I think just that next level of when we're making those connections, it really helps in terms of identifying new leaders and getting people plugged in. So from here, I think giving some examples of successful times that we have engaged local residents in organizing wins. And I do, there's a little bit of a disclaimer with this that, it's not to overemphasize how powerful we actually are, because it's not like we get our own way. And it's not, or oftentimes we don't get our way, I should say, in that there is a fair amount of struggling forward or trying to, quote, like lose forward in our campaign work. I think these next slides are highlighting just clear-cut wins that we'd love to lift up, but that so much of the most important work is a diligent moving the needle over time. And this goes back to the question that was raised earlier about related to redevelopment funds, that what happened when we lost that funding, and that a lot of I think the campaigns that we feel proudest about have been these statewide and county and jurisdiction level bond measures that have raised revenues for the creation of affordable housing. And so a great example was Measure KK, or Measure A1 too. These were passed, and you can see on her shirt it says Measure JJ. That was a separate measure, but campaigning at the same time. For the county of Alameda, and this was in 2018, or 2016 rather. And so really off the back of the 2012 loss of revenues. There was also, we mentioned this earlier, Propositions 1 and 2. These are not permanent funding sources, but these were really huge historic victories for bringing the issue to voters and having California voters vote yes on affordable housing. And I think it's funky because of how redevelopment agencies were dissolved. And I think what this shows is that Californians still want tax dollars going towards affordable housing, and they're still naming this as a key issue, and that it ought not to be separated from the work of like local redevelopment agencies, but it was. So these were two big wins, and these are huge historic revenue measures that are not permanent solutions by any means, but big wins in 2018 that were resident led. You can see here residents at that press rally, and then the next one was in 2016, the Alameda County Measure A1. Sorry, I foreshadowed this one earlier, but there's actually a really fun image of this one. Maybe I forgot to add it up. We worked with residents of affordable housing to create like an A1 steak bottle, and that the recipe on the bottle was the recipe for housing justice. And so it was like there's a lot of really powerful images of resident organizing in moments when we've come together really powerfully. And you can see here on the mic different residents of affordable housing telling their stories about how affordable housing has transformed their lives, how affordable housing has been such a gift for them, right, to provide success and opportunity for them. And so there's this storytelling from the residents about the importance of it. And then I think that it really does help make the argument for why there should always be more. And then of course we know there can never be enough. Or there can never be too much, I should say. And at the hyper local level, Berkeley, city of Berkeley, we ran a $135 million campaign just for the city of Berkeley, where especially, yeah, it gets really cool at the most micro level, I think, because of the ways we generate the revenue. And so in Berkeley, which is a quite progressive city, they were able to generate this $8 million per year through real estate. Introducing a tax on that that goes towards affordable housing creation. So these are examples of where resident organizing can go into. These are local, state, city level campaigns that are directly addressing the need for more affordable housing, that build power in communities about the issues. And there was one more slide related to this, just highlighting other kinds of advocacy, but I'm wondering, Azul, do you want to pause it in here? Oh,
yes, we definitely can. Sorry, my internet cut out for a second, but yeah, do y'all have any questions? I know we're gonna go into a breakout room for just a few minutes so y'all can talk to each other about everything you've learned and just thoughts. But do y'all have any questions on the last section, Ronald, whatever the wins, or like the add value when talking about it in advocacy conversations with residents or with your staff members? And if not, we can just move to the breakout sessions. Let me just reshare, but pretty much the goal is for y'all to just collaborate a little bit, talk about, you know, what are the things that you got out of this presentation? What do you think, what tools do you need as resident services staff to actually be able to implement some of this work? And really just anything you want to talk about. I think it's really about what y'all want to do. If you don't want to follow the prompt, that's fine too. So I'm going to just send y'all to the breakout rooms. We could also stay as one large group since we're not too big. So if y'all would like to do that, we can do that as well. Does anyone want to +1 that? Or does anyone prefer breakout rooms? Okay, cool. So we got a few +1s. So yeah, does anyone want to just talk a little bit about what we have talked about so far, as like what are some of the tools that you feel like you need to be able to implement this, or just how to identify leadership, or anything you want to talk about? Anyone feel free to unmute.
Hi, this is Burnaby with Link Housing. I think that what Ronald covered in the beginning about the history of housing, the redlining, and how the discriminatory practices, some of them which are still in place, I think that all is kind of really important for people to know where they came from, how they got to the situation. A lot of people may feel that they might have had something to do with it, but they don't know the background of everything that's been working against them. That also attributes to the situation. I think we could really empower our residents by teaching them this, and they kind of seen what people done in the past to be progressive, and then join different movements and grassroots organizing to continue forward.
That's an awesome point, and I think that that's really important because oftentimes, I know as myself, a person who grew up low income and lived in unstable housing, like it does impact your self-esteem. So I think that's a great point to bring into how to boost morale and how to get people engaged. Does anyone else want to talk a little bit? Or does anyone want to plus one on what Burnaby just said?
I think what stood out for me going through the wins and the hyper local advocacy that has to happen, because now we're trying to get funding for affordable housing at the county, regional, and local levels, right? It's made, I think, affordable housing much more visible to people when you have, local efforts like that, and encourages accountability. And at the same time, I think needs to be accompanied with a lot of education, because we're seeing with Prop HHH in LA, in the city of LA, there's just a lot of backlash in terms of why is it taking so long to build? It's been 3 years since this was instituted. Most of them haven't started construction yet. So kind of like a general understanding of affordable housing as a whole. And this is so valuable. And I think that piece of education could also be really helpful for RS staff to know and then to impart on the residents, because I think people may be interested. I mean, we given the opportunity to be decision makers and to tell their stories or advocate for certain issues, but this context runs so deep that I don't know how that you turn that into an actual on the ground strategy, but just thinking out loud, that the education piece. I'm a community outreach coordinator, and I've dealt with meetings, a lot of NIMBY comments and things, and even my own education, I think it is, needs to continue to grow. So anyway, how do we incorporate education while taking action? Because we know we have to keep moving.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think to that, I would just say, considering alternative or like innovative education strategies, like maybe a PowerPoint is not accessible, but what could be accessible is, a 30-minute YouTube video in the community space, or a poster that talks about racial justice. There's different things that we can think about outside of the classroom setting of education. But yeah, that's a great point. Does anyone else want to talk a little bit?
Yeah, just to branch off of the education piece. So Link Housing is working on bringing more diversity, equity, and inclusion right now. And I know we've had talks about maybe providing in our onboarding of new staff, education regarding this, education regarding the historical narrative of affordable housing and those injustices there. So I think that is something that we're talking about. And I don't know what that looks like, but I feel like the continuous training and it's setting that culture and that tone when someone new joins also is really important, be it corporate staff or field staff. So yeah, I definitely second everyone's call to action to have more education.
Yeah, I know I've given everyone some feedback, but just on that point, I think, Angel, that's so important, because for me, in doing advocacy, I always think about how to decentralize whiteness in a way that's actionable. And I think oftentimes that it comes down to culture and organizational culture of hey, why are we portraying history in X amount of way, or why are we not talking about the racial inequality that's persisted over time? So yeah, shifting cultural narrative in the workplace is a huge part of advocacy. So I just wanted to plus one that.
And I know you talked about, how or what tools we might need to develop leadership for our residents. And I think that was something we've been thinking about as an organization, because we want to partner with the Residents United Network, which also, brings residents into that space where they're able to advocate for affordable housing policy. But I think there is a little bit of a gap in my understanding of, what do these leadership qualities look like? I think we've said, if they show up to programs, it shows involvement. But I don't know if anyone has other feedback about more tangible ways that we might be able to see or track, who would be someone who might want to step into that kind of space?
I love that. I really appreciate that question about like who are these, who makes a good leader or not. And I think truthfully, and I think because so much of it is about like storytelling in this new way that emphasizes what's actually been experienced by individuals and by whole communities, and then like that's actually a really strategic way to build more public will for affordable housing. Just that thinking of who are those, maybe those unlikely leaders, right? Like who do I have a resident who holds, you know, different I mean, I think it's not about identity politics, but there is a, like, I'm thinking of working in Berkeley with former Black Party members who were so old, really seniors, but who had so much like history of movement and organizing, getting to know them and seeing that that was their passion. So I would offer, I guess, in talking it through, like, who are the folks that you think are really passionate about housing justice? You know, do you have residents who are out there already volunteering in the unhoused encampments? Or do you have residents who you know are, you know, just maybe they're part of a Democratic club or a part of the NAACP or something like that? And then trying to get them interested in working with affordable housing advocacy networks like Run. And then do you have a resident who's seems like an unlikely leader, who's isolated, who's maybe not telling their story, who could get something out of, who has something to give and to receive from coming into organizing work? And I think those are the folks that we often see get most active. It's when it starts to become a part of their life that brings them a feeling of belonging or something like that.
Am I allowed to ask another question on top of that?
Sure.
I'm wondering, from your experiences, if there are certain questions that you feel draw that out, certain questions where the response is like the resident feels empowered, and then they, you know, kind of step into that space.
You know, I would say someone I talked to on actually Ronald's EBHO chats talking about history on a multi-series. One of the resident services coordinators there talked to me about a parking lot, and for whatever reason, this example really stuck to me. It was like such a small act of advocacy in the larger scheme, but so meaningful to those residents. And I think that even a small event like that can trigger leadership development. These residents really wanted accessible parking because they live in downtown Oakland, and there isn't an opportunity for them to park their car in an affordable place. So they wanted to put together kind of like a group of people in the site to talk about what it would look like to then petition the city to get designated parking for their unit. So I think it's not always has to be like, oh, let's, like, you know, find the solution to all racial injustice. Like sometimes it's small pieces of things that happen that then people get ignited, then they start to develop that feeling of belonging, that feeling of feeling passionate about something, and they start building towards something. And then when you have that momentum, that's when you can engage people with other topics and other themes, and then they start to come up with their own themes as residents. So I think it's really about a balance between trying to guide people to become leaders, but also allowing leadership to develop organically. Yeah, so I don't know if other people have thoughts on that.
I was just gonna add that there's no like one golden question. I think in general and I maybe I'm thinking about this a little backwards. I'd say with my organizer hat on, it's about meeting people where they're at, and so not so much trying to get something a statement from them, but rather trying to plant a seed, and then in that way there are really strategic question or like call response. I'm thinking of questions around, the idea of affordable housing, honestly. And I think if like, when I meet a resident who, you know, has a story that they know is really powerful and loves to tell their story, and if I feel impacted by it, I love to, follow up by asking, like, okay, well, what about your story is true of the whole community, right? And trying to get them to think more big picture, about how their experience fits into this bigger thing that we actually need to come together and organize around if we're actually going to solve those issues. And so there's like a way of asking people questions that helps move them into action, which is, I would say, is another webinar on its own. But I think the other thing too is, y'all have my contact and Azul's contact, and I think if certainly this is also the first session of the Cave series, so yeah, I think part 3 you'll get a lot of that. And then if at the end of the series you still have that question on your mind, I'd really love if you reach out, send me an email, because there's a lot more to that side of organizing.
Could I ask a very quick question, just to try and kind of mine some of your expertise? If we were looking at sort of starting a STUCO, student council or youth council, under the heading of empowerment and advocacy, have you come across, or in your experience, I mean, is what kind of topics should we be asking our very young emerging leaders to tackle? And that, have you come across any agencies or organizations who are doing it really effectively, not just sort of ticking the box?
Powerful youth work. I think of youth. What is this group? There's a great one.
I can't spell that.
It's that's a noise I make when I'm really trying to remember something. But yeah, there's a group in Oakland. Azul, do you know this group, or do you have it? It's like youth art. I'm not gonna say it right, but what they do is they engage youth in actual like hands-on stuff. And so I think what was really impactful, when I was hearing about their work, and when there was a lot of excitement amongst youth around their work, they were building a tiny home for an unhoused mother. And so it was a project that I think that made the youth feel like, this is an action really aligned to our values that they're excited about. They're also doing this hands-on thing of actually building a thing. They're breaking some rules, technically, because you're not supposed to offer refuge to unhoused people. There's laws against that. So I think there's all this like, and I would say there's in that example, I do think that's part of the recipe. Is it exciting? Is it real? Does it speak to them? Does it feel like it's kind of visionary? And I think something project-based that they can put their hands in. And there's other great examples here in the chat too of youth organizing work.
I just had one comment about the participation of residents as a part of advocacy. I think it's so critical and impactful on all levels. Even when you have these initiatives that come up and you have residents go to town hall meetings and tell their stories. And I just wanted to know, what type of infrastructure would you imagine for a resident advocacy type of group? And then how do you keep the continuum going with keeping the residents' interest in that type of role?
I've got so many responses to that. But Azul, was that one that you wanted to speak to at all, Azul?
I feel like you have a lot more direct experience organizing residents. And this might just sound like a little funny, but I think while I was working at Chinatown Community Development Center, one of the really cool things that they did for residents to get them to participate in like volunteer opportunities or like community gatherings was just like getting them lunch. And I feel like that's like such a small thing, but it makes a difference. Like people are like, oh, there'll be lunch there. Like it's going to be like a fun experience. Because I think, we have to also be conscious of the fact that this is their home, and this is where they live, and they don't want to feel pressured to do things. So it will be nice to like kind of make it a community oriented space also. So it could be like an arts and crafts space, or different themes that will resonate with residents. Those are just some of the thoughts I have.
Thank you.
And then I guess I would add to that when you bring the residents into this, absolutely for food. I would never do a meeting with residents without at least some snacks, right? And I think there's also ways to offer them stipends in the work too, especially depending on who they're doing the advocacy for. And if it's on behalf of a community development organization, maybe they're turning out to give testimony at a city council meeting or something like that, or showing up in conference spaces, or however they're being used as advocates for the goals of a community development organization. Oftentimes it can be stipended, which is a great thing to be able to offer residents who are not doing it ever for the money, but it's a draw, and just recognizing where people are at. And then like the space itself, if it's a nourishing space where they feel like they're coming together, obviously for a justice mission, right, that should be at the forefront, but if there's also community building happening, or if there's opportunities for people to just check in and say, what did they go through this week, or there's ways to make it really appealing as a space, and nourishing. And that also actually has great returns on the advocacy, because as the space becomes more tight knit, and it becomes more powerful.
Awesome. Thanks for that, y'all. I just want to be conscious of time. We just have a few minutes left. So I would like to just power through the little bit of presentation we have, but also like to make space for questions. So if y'all could stay as long as you can, that's really great. If you have to hop off hard deadline 11:30, that's understandable as well. But this is just the first of the 3-part series. So I'm really excited to hear that so many of y'all are so excited about this topic, and already have so many good ideas. So one of the things that I would recommend after this session is starting an action plan. I'm going to send y'all a template, and it's really just like an activity. I think like, what is your short-term goal with resident advocacy? What is your long-term goal with engagement? And then what's your personal advocacy goal? And I think that I really want to highlight this section. So like, what is your own personal reminder to yourself of like, why is advocacy important to you? Or what is your professional development goal? So you can start to think about how this all relates to your own mental health, your own feelings of feeling connected to your community. And say it's just a fun activity. You can choose to do it or not. In the next session, we'll talk a little bit about it, but it's not a hard requirement. And then I just wanted to go over for the next week's session, or sorry, in 3 weeks. This is a 3-week, every 3 weeks. So for the next part, we're going to talk about sparking engagement, organizer narratives, and digital organizing strategies. So this is one way that we can think about how to maybe track leadership or track involvement, or sending emails in a way that's accessible, that people want to engage with it. And we'll also hear from Hang, who is an expert in resident services advocacy. She works at Saha, and she's done a lot of these advocacy things for a longer period of time. And experience is really everything when we're thinking about on the ground. So I wanted to just share a little bit about what that's going to look like. So some of the next steps, I really recommend that y'all chat with at least one person from your team or a resident about one historical housing justice victory or one historical housing justice thing that happened from today's training, so you can start to practice what it's like to engage with people and also just start conversations. Consider filling out your action plan for your own goals and commitment. I sent some videos that go along with this session as well as articles, depending on how much time you have. If that's something that feels accessible to you, please do check it out. Again, our next session will be October 15th. And I would just recommend to encourage other folks on your staff to participate. Even if they miss the first session, there's going to be a recording and they can just either follow along to the recordings or participate in the in-person sessions. So yeah, so any last questions or thoughts or feedback or something you would like to see in the next session? I really would like this to be as collaborative as possible.
Irma, can I ask, was it?
Thank you all for your time.
Yeah. Oh, thank you.
Thanks so much.
What was your question, Ronald?
Oh, I was calling you out, Irma, just for your thoughts and reflections. And I know you also with Azul saw some of this earlier, and is it helpful to see it again this way? And are you excited about
Actually,
it?
it was mostly the last part, because like you said, some of it was a recount, and I seen the first part of it, and but everything else that was new, I actually enjoyed it, and I'm gonna have to implement it and try and get my other reps to join in the next session, because I think it'll be, even though you guys are for Oakland, the Oakland County, it also has a lot to do with Contra Costa as well.
Thanks for those closing
Yeah,
thoughts.
all the information was really good.
Nice. I'm definitely feeling the urge to run away.
Yeah, of course. Your cat
Go
is so
find your
lost.
cat.
Yeah.
Please, everybody, wish me luck.
Good luck. But yeah, we can
Good
all
luck.
end. Y'all can get a few minutes back unless someone has a really pressing question, but I always love to give people time back. And thanks again, Ronald, for being here, even though your cat's lost.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone, for participating. Bye.
Bye.
I didn't call you.